Doom Eternal Next Generation patch is out, and Alex Battaglia did an awesome job covering it last week, looking at the ray tracing and PC features. But he did not get into the details regarding the console version's metrics, and lots of people are curious. Does it live up to what id Software is claiming? As has become common this gen, id Software has opted to offer multiple display modes for each console. So today we're going to talk about each of those modes, how it performs, how it looks, and more. And to do that, I brought along Richard Leadbetter.
Hey John, how you doing? So I too was thoroughly impressed with Alex's video, and coming out of that we've essentially established that, console ray tracing is essentially on par with what PC's medium, and uses dynamic resolution to maintain performance. So that's the sort of baseline that we have going into this, but there's a lot more to talk about. We've got 3 consoles and a total of 8 modes to talk about here.
Yes, and I've become intimately familiar with these modes after a full day's worth of testing them. And part of the issue with that is actually good for players, as we'll discuss shortly.
Okay.
But first, I do want to highlight the fact that this is just continued support that Doom Eternal has received. id Software has done an amazing job. Some of the best post-launch support I think I've seen, especially for a single-player game like this. I mean, they've added those 2 excellent DLC packs to the mix, upgraded a bunch of things, tweaked the games, and it's just a superb experience on every single platform. Even if you go play on an original Xbox One from 2013, it still looks and plays great, which is awesome, I think. And they really deserve sort of, I think, kudos for offering such a great game no matter where you play it. And obviously this new version for the next-gen machines is even better.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's kind of like the cherry on top then, right?
It is. This feels like the finale, if you will. This is the logical conclusion. Although they did reveal this week that they're still working on sort of a horde mode as well now. So there's still more stuff coming. So yeah.
And I think on top of that, the fact that we're seeing stuff like ray tracing and 120 Hz support, it's almost like a preview of sorts of where they intend to take id Tech 7 next.
Yeah, that's my guess as well, especially considering how they've always focused on 60 frames per second for consoles, going back to Rage, which has a very different foundation, of course. And I would assume that for the next generation, actually, even for a new game, I'd imagine 120 Hz will become the new target. So, very curious to see where that goes. But let's talk about Doom Eternal. Right now, we have 3 modes on PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, and 2 modes on Series S. That means you get the balance mode, which is the default. There's ray tracing, and there's 120 Hz. Ray tracing is not available on Xbox Series S. It's not entirely clear what the reasoning for that is, as we've seen ray tracing on this console before. I would imagine something that we've raised in the past is that it might be a memory limitation. That seems most likely, as I'd imagine the GPU has enough grunt to handle this at a lower resolution with ray tracing. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've seen with Metro Exodus and Watch Dogs Legion that, it can do ray tracing, but there are limitations in place. And I suspect if we looked at the PC version and the difference in memory utilization between RT on and RT off, we may well see our answer there as to why it's not on Series S.
Yes, that's a good point. And thinking of PC, that's something, so Alex talked a lot about this ray tracing mode, and I agree with everything he said. Even with the default medium settings as we get on consoles, the ray tracing here is excellent. It makes a huge difference, especially in some of these levels here, like this facility area where you've got this sort of cityscape outside. The use of cube maps, I always thought sort of brought it down. It didn't look quite right because they have a lot of these glass buildings. But when you enable ray tracing, it's just simply transformative. And it's really like that throughout. So even if you're on console and you can't change the smoothness value or make any of the other tweaks possible on PC, it looks awesome. And the resolution of the reflections is 1/3 that of the current rendering resolution. And that's probably what we should get into now. And this is the 3 modes. What do they look like in terms of image quality? What should we start with, Rich?
I guess we should be looking at ray tracing on Series X and PS5.
Yeah, that sounds good. So, essentially, these are very, very close. They both operate with a maximum resolution of 1800p in the ray tracing mode, and of course dynamic resolution scaling is used. The absolute minimum is 50% of the internal resolution, but in practice the lowest you'll typically see is around 70%, or roughly 1260p or so. But it's often higher than this, so it does actually look pretty good. I should note that just sort of glancing through the different shots of the game running on both consoles, it does seem like Series X holds a higher resolution on average when using this mode. But they are otherwise pretty comparable.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, this is going to be kind of like a running theme of this particular discussion, really, that it's actually really solid and does exactly what it says on the tin.
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that, so first of all, there is no anisotropic filtering in any of these modes, which Alex also pointed out. That is noticeable. And even though the pixel count is quite high much of the time, this is a case where I feel like they could use maybe either adjustments to the LOD bias or some sort of extra sharpening. It feels like there's just something else we need there to get the sharpness up a little bit, because the resolution is high enough as is, I think, for this mode, but it does sometimes appear just slightly softer than you might like. And I don't think it's just down to pixel count.
Okay, fair enough. So that's the ray tracing mode then. It can be quite soft, based on the comparisons that Alex did with the PC version. Even against a 2060 with DLSS, but yeah, it holds up, it looks great, and I agree with you, the features that you're getting here.
And that's more down, I think, DLSS itself does a remarkable job in this game in terms of cleaning up the image, and that starts from a lower pixel count as well. So even though the resolution is often higher than that, it can't quite match the image you get when using DLSS from a lower resolution source. So that is true.
But the key point is we're getting ray tracing at 60 frames per second, and it is looking great.
Exactly. Then there's the 120 Hz mode, and this is available on all three. And of course, the main benefit here is more responsive gameplay and just sort of a smoother looking game experience. Of course, if you want to enjoy this at the full resolution, you'll need an HDMI 2.1 capable display. Otherwise, you'll be locked down to a lower resolution. But if you have that, essentially, and this is interesting, so Xbox Series X still hits 1800p max, and it does seem to it has a similar sort of variation as we saw in ray tracing mode, as best as I can tell, but PlayStation 5 is capped at 1584p instead, which in practice means that the resolution can actually slip just a little under 1080p in select circumstances. So it's definitely not as sharp as the Xbox version in general when using this mode. And then last we have the Series S, which is below this, of course, capping out at a maximum of 1080p. And in practice, the lowest I saw was around 70%, which is just above 720p or so. Again, it can technically, I guess, go lower, I would imagine, but in general, it seems to sort of fall between 720 and 1080p during normal gameplay.
Interesting.
But I would guess that, so they specifically noted that the series consoles make use of variable rate shading. It's not yet available on PC, and obviously the Tier 2 VRS is not available on PS5. I mean, what do you think? To me, it seems like this might contribute slightly to the extra performance boost, beyond the slightly more capable GPU in the Xbox anyways.
Yeah, it's interesting what's going on here, and the fact that they have actually implemented it. And I guess maybe we should draw a line under the whole VRS thing, because, you know, in the run-up to launch, there are a bunch of people out there that couldn't believe that PS5 doesn't have it. It doesn't have it at a hardware level, Tier 2 VRS. Tier 1 VRS can be emulated by using the MSAA hardware on the GPU, which is what Metro Exodus does. So PS5 can do VRS of a sort, but it can't do Tier 2 VRS, which is a lot more interesting, much higher quality, and it's really interesting. I think this might be the first third-party game to use Tier 2 VRS on the series consoles. And again, in Alex's video, he highlighted essentially evidence that it was there. And I don't want people to think, you know, he highlighted VRS artifacts with a 400% zoom, but it wasn't really to criticize that VRS was being used, more to show that, you know, the technology was actually in place. So I don't know about you, but I don't actually notice any perceptible hit to image quality.
Yeah. So during normal gameplay, it's very difficult to pick that up. If you look closely, you will see it. But, you know, it's important to stress that on all platforms due to the nature of this game and as fast as it is. As long as you're over, like, you know, if you're above 1080p, it still looks pretty darn crisp and clean. The Series S is the only one where it looks fine, absolutely, and it's clean, but it's definitely, when you're playing on a 4K screen, it's pretty blurry. If you hook it up to a CRT, though, it's pretty good.
Maybe that's the next CRT video we need to do. But yeah, I suspect there's going to be a lot of Series S's out there that are actually connected to 1080p screens, in which case, happy days.
But if you are pushing for higher pixel counts, this is what the third mode, which is called Balanced, offers. And both on Series X and PS5, it aims right for native 4K. It does still use DRS, but by and large, it maintains a very high pixel count, and it's noticeably sharper than any other mode in any prior console version. Now, of course, again, this is a fast game. You don't necessarily notice this normally, I would say. So I would still prefer the other modes over this, but it's cool to have the option if you really want those pristine pixels and you're sitting close to a large display. And Series S, of course, that tops out at 1440p then, which in practice, it ends up looking kind of similar to how Doom Eternal looks on the PS4 Pro, I would say.
Okay.
So it's, if you know what that looks like, it's kind of similar there. I mean, there's some slight variations, of course, but by and large, it looks good.
And so, that's another 4 teraflop GPU.
Exactly. And that's actually something that's going to come up in the next section, I think. And that next section is, of course, performance. And this one is tricky because, of course, usually you play through a game, you're looking for dips that you sort of take note of and try to get that performance capture data. I played through a lot of this game, again, on these platforms, and I found that it was extremely challenging to actually find any performance dips at all. So, starting with the balanced mode, this one is easy to cover because it is basically flawless. The only dip I noticed is occasionally when you get a checkpoint, you get like a 1 or 2 frame dip.
Right.
And it's almost imperceptible, but that's it. I mean, it's just solid. So super high res, rock solid frame rate, that's what you get with balanced. But of course, ray tracing in 120 hertz is a lot more interesting, but still very positive. So 120 hertz then. This is the one where, at least, I mean, what do you think? For me, this is where I actually expected to see some dips.
Yeah, I think so, because typically when we've seen the early 120 hertz modes on titles like Devil May Cry Special Edition, for example, they don't generally tend to be super solid. But on the flip side, Doom Eternal is architected on one of the most astonishingly well-threaded engines I think I've seen.
Precisely.
I mean, it's to the point
Exactly.
where, when I did the Core i5 11400F review, this £150 CPU was routinely running the game in excess of 300 frames per second. So 120, walk in the park, right?
Exactly. And that's kind of what I find here. By and large, all 3 versions, it's just a flat 120 frames per second across the board, which I have to admit was really actually, again, a little bit surprising on the surface, but when you start to consider what id Tech can do, it does start to make sense. Again, you will notice those checkpoint stutters, and I did occasionally notice a single frame dip here or there, but it's relatively rare and it's very, very nice. The only area from the first half of the game that I noted any issues at all, and by the way, obviously for those watching, we can't test the entire game on all platforms in every mode. That's actually, like, it's not feasible, right? So you kind of have to pick and choose. I tried to go for some of the heavier scenes, and the Ark Complex is actually one of those scenes, specifically out in this area here. Now, all 3 versions exhibit a specific type of slowdown right when you arrive in this area, when you're turned to the other direction and firing rockets, so you get alpha effects right up in the camera frustum. Of the 3, Series S is the slowest. It happens a couple times when looking in this direction, as you can see from the graph. The other versions, though, you kind of get the same thing, but it's so brief that it's almost difficult to pick up. But I was actually actively hunting for this, and in fact, all of my testing, I spent time just firing as many things as I could at near enemies to cause alpha effects to fill the screen in an attempt to sort of like push the overdraw, but it's very difficult to cause any slowdown at all. So it's a little boring in that sense, but it's really good news, right?
Well, it is, because first of all, what I found is that a lot of 120 hertz modes don't lock to 120 hertz. And on the Xbox side, you need to have VRR enabled to actually get a smooth experience. Otherwise, it's quite a lot of like micro stutter. PlayStation 5 generally it seems to work out pretty well, but again, if it can't lock to 120, you don't have VRR to save you then. So to actually get a lock is actually quite important, I think.
I agree, and it really is. It's a very, very stable. And also, to me, this sort of highlights what the new CPUs can bring to the table, because as you mentioned earlier, the PS4 Pro is also a roughly 4 teraflop machine, just like Xbox Series S. But I'd say it's all but impossible that they could ever reach a stable 120 hertz on that console. But the Series S manages it just fine.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, so yeah, that's great news. Then there's the ray tracing, which is actually better than the 120 hertz mode. This same section in the art complex seems to run very well on both consoles here. You get a nice smooth 60 FPS. And I think that's really what we have to stress here. Like, it has improved a lot with this generation, let's be clear, but more like just the sheer stability of every single mode in this game on all these machines is really something I think that deserves praise and attention, because it really, again, I know this is a cross-generation game, but they've added heavy features in here. 120 hertz is not a walk in the park, nor is ray tracing. So to get performance this good is definitely awesome.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And the fact that it is a free upgrade,
precisely,
is just
exactly
icing on the cake, really.
Now, a couple other things to note though while we're here. First of all, loading times. It's very, very fast. Again, it was already pretty okay on the other consoles, but here it's basically almost instant. Just a quick little loading screen and you're in the game. Though it is interesting from these results, while it is very fast, it's actually like twice as fast on the PS5 versus the two Xbox machines. So there's definitely an advantage there. But still, overall, the loading times are quite fast, so that's good. The only negative thing I'd have to say here, honestly, is the upgrade situation on PS5 was a little bit convoluted. It did not work initially on the first day. You could purchase the thing for free from the PlayStation Store, but the game itself remained locked, so you couldn't actually start it, which was annoying. That did get solved, though. And beyond that, then, there is no option to carry over your saves. So you basically start with a fresh save on PlayStation 5. So to get all these tests, I actually did end up playing through, that much of the game, the first 6 missions, essentially, to get everything I needed. Which was good, because it did kind of give me a chance to really look for any sort of heavy areas. But I didn't really find any, so it was really just an exercise in seeing more of the game with this patch. And then I kind of went back to any areas that seemed heavy and tried them on Xbox. But the fact that the upgrade situation like this, it is definitely sort of a win for the smart delivery program, I think.
The saves just work, right?
It just came right over. So everything I'd played through the game on Xbox, and yeah, everything was just there and unlocked from the beginning, no problem. So definitely one benefit on that machine.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, it's exactly what's written on the tin. They delivered excellent performance across the board. It still looks great. It's still Doom Eternal. Really, the only issue is what we just mentioned with the upgrade situation. But even that, it's more like an excuse to play Doom Eternal again, which is no bad thing, I would say. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Brilliant. Well, I'm looking forward to checking this one out. Probably do it on PC, mind you, but it's great to see that pretty much all the consoles have received a lot of care and attention here.
Yeah, and I would actually say that kind of the PC version is still the supreme version, in the sense that you don't have to pick between ray tracing and 120 hertz. You can kind of do both. As long as you have a suitably capable PC, it is possible. Plus the boost from DLSS, if using an NVIDIA card, I mean, it does look genuinely great. It really cleans up the image in terms of creating a sharper looking output. Plus, this is a game that's so fast that, to be honest, I think it plays much better with the mouse. It's perfectly playable on consoles, but just that extra precision you get definitely makes for a more enjoyable experience. So, but still, as I said at the beginning, no matter which version you play, Doom Eternal is solid. And considering how many ports and variations they've done of this game now, that's really impressive. So,
absolutely.
Hats off to them. But that's going to do it for this video, so thanks for joining me, Rich.
Oh, it's been a pleasure.
And if you guys enjoyed this video and made it all the way to the end, of course, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, follow us on Twitter, and check us out over on Patreon if you want to see a pristine version of this video and others. But until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.